Okay, so we are live. Welcome, Professor Saulius Geniusas. Welcome, Lucas Machado. This is the opening session for our festival this year. Actually, we thought of it as warming up. We are very much interested in philosophical questions related to game studies and to the game industry as well. We see that, of course, everyone knows that games have become such an important cultural artifact with lots of social and cultural and even health implications for children, for the youth, for the population in general. We know that global revenues in the game industry are now larger than cinema, the film industry and music industry together. So it's a huge market, and we firmly believe that it requires criticism and a constructive and creative perspective. So welcome, Professor Saulius. I will give the floor to Lucas Machado first, so he will welcome you as well, and then I'll go to the backstage and help our fellows with our simultaneous translation. Thank you very much, and have a good session, fellows. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, good morning, everyone. Like Gilson said, it's a pleasure to have Professor Saulius Geniusas with us here, who is currently a professor at the University of Hong Kong, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sorry.
Yes,
Yes,
that's right.
of Hong Kong, and works on the fields of phenomenology and continental philosophy, and has written works also discussing the problem of immersion in video games and among other issues connected with phenomenology. Has won several prizes on this field, and it's a pleasure really to be able to have the professor here with us to discuss about this issue, which is so relevant to think about games and in the field of game studies in general, which is the issue of immersion and how can we understand immersion in games and in general. So I'm really looking forward to your talk, Professor. Once again, thank you very much for being with us here. And please feel free to begin whenever you want.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you also for these introductory words. It's a pleasure for me, an honor also to be giving this opening talk. So my talk will focus on the concept of immersion, which is of central importance in game studies. And what I want to do is open up a dialogue between game studies and the field in which I work myself, namely phenomenology. And I want to do so by zeroing in, by focusing on this concept of immersion, which is a central concept in game studies. And I want to show what kind of contribution phenomenology can make while addressing this concept. So first, let me begin by clarifying how this concept is understood in game studies, and afterwards, I'll turn to phenomenology and to its contribution. When it comes to game studies, immersion is understood as self-transference that is coupled with a sense of trickery and self-deception. So one enters into the artificial world of a digital game, and one is tricked into believing that one is somewhere other than one's embodied location. So some even suggest that the individual recognizes this self-deception as self-deception. So what we have here is a certain kind of a double consciousness. Yes? The player is aware of the artificiality of play, no matter how deep the immersion. That is, players know that the game is unreal, yet at the same time, they believe the game to be real. One willingly subjects oneself to self-deception, which one continues to recognize as self-deception. One takes seriously what is only play, while recognizing play as play. As seen from the standpoint of game studies, immersion is a technically shaped psychological experience. It is a matter of being present in a virtual environment. It's a matter of forgetting about the here and now and just being there in the virtual world. It's just a matter of experiencing the virtual surroundings as though they were actual. So we are talking here about a technologically generated experience, which the subject recognizes as shaped technologically and at the same time takes seriously. But now one has to ask whether all forms of immersion are necessarily shaped technologically. And this is deeply questionable. So if this turns out not to be the case, then one obtains the further means to raise the possibility that immersion in digital games is just one mode of immersion among others. Now, the dominant analysis of immersion in game studies rely on too insular a conception of immersion. They presuppose, and I would argue illegitimately, that technical immersion is the only mode of immersion there is. And it is this insularity, then, that has blocked the possibility of raising the question whether research undertaken in other fields might not shed light on the meaning of immersion in digital games. So then let me proceed towards a phenomenology of immersion. And let me state at the very start that immersion is a much broader phenomenon than the literature on game studies suggest. So there is immersion in the digital world, but there is also immersion in the inner world. So think here of immersion in dreams, in fantasies, or even in memories. Then besides that, there is also immersion in the aesthetic world, in paintings, in cinema, in theater, in music, or fiction. And then also there is immersion in the world of play. And here by play I mean play of cards, or play of chess, or a football game. The differences between these modes of immersion have to be further addressed as intramodal differences within the general modality of immersion. In all cases, we are faced with experiences which begin as an interruption of former experiences. When immersed, the individual largely forgets about the world of daily concerns. Immersion rests on the shoulders of the suspension of the practical outlook, which otherwise characterizes our basic everyday experience. A certain there and then displaces the here and now that otherwise characterizes our engagement in the world of daily concerns. While one remains conscious of the here and now in the background, one is thematically immersed in the there and then. Immersion is a matter of transitioning from the here and now to the there and then, and of apprehending this there and then as if it were here and now. Immersion marks the individual's capacity to substitute non-actuality for actuality and to relate to non-actuality as if it were actuality, while also recognizing it as non-actuality. Immersion is a matter of self-displacement, which the subject recognizes as self-displacement. Now, at this point, so as to understand this experience or this phenomenology of immersion better, I want to turn to some phenomenological thinkers, and I want to begin with Alfred Schutz and his account of the finite provinces of meaning. What is of importance here is Schutz's account of multiple realities. It is of importance because a digital game is just one reality among others. For Schutz, paramount reality, and by this he means the world of everyday experience, is not the only reality. Consciousness can suspend paramount reality and transition into other finite provinces of meaning, understood as realities in a derivative sense. So one can transition from the world of daily life into the worlds of phantasms, dreams, scientific theory, art, politics, or religion. Schutter's account of multiple realities enables us to answer a very important question. When it finds itself in the state of immersion, what exactly does consciousness immerse itself in? The Schutzian answer reads as follows. It immerses itself in one of the finite provinces of meaning, in one of the multiple realities. Building on Schutzian resources, one can suggest that we transition into specific realities by means of a specific epoche, which is a technical term in phenomenology. So one does so by suspending doubt, which otherwise accompanies the consciousness of irreal objects and its relation to the irreal world. From this world of everyday life, one leaps into the other provinces of meaning by adopting the specific epoche appropriate to each province. I can enter a specific finite province of meaning without losing the self-awareness which allows me to perceive myself as the person that I am. For example, I can play a digital game while knowing perfectly well that I need to exit at the next stop on the metro line, or while having a conversation on the phone, or even while walking on the street. By contrast, if I am to immerse myself in a finite province of meaning, such as a digital game, then at least to some degree, I no longer perceive myself as the person that I am. So also, at least to some degree, I lose the awareness of my surroundings. So immersion, you see, is a matter of self-forgetfulness. But this self-forgetfulness can come in degrees. The greater the immersion in a digital game, the greater the self-identification with a virtual self, which in effect brings about a greater semblance of presence. Taking this into account, one can state that without addressing self-forgetfulness, one can have only a limited understanding of immersion. So with this in mind, then, I would now like to turn to another thinker, a largely overlooked thinker, whose contribution is little appreciated, not only in game studies, but also in contemporary phenomenology. And I have in mind Theodor Conrad and his account of the structures of immersed experience. Theodor Conrad had written more extensively about immersion than any other classical or contemporary phenomenologist. His outstanding but little known book about the essential doctrine of psychic life and experience was published in 1968. And in this book, Conrad maintained that experiences can unfold both from the here and now and from the there and then. This, in effect, means that experience can unfold from two different egoic situations, from a displaced and a non-displaced standpoint. Displaced experiences are of three types, he argues. What I experience from a displaced standpoint is something I either have experienced before, or I will experience in the future, or I could experience. Now, Conrad draws a highly important distinction between real and spiritual dimensions of experience. And here the term spiritual need not be understood in a religious sense of the term, but the German term for that is geistig, as a term that has to do not with natural sciences, but rather with human and social sciences. So the real dimension, one can only exist here and now. But the spiritual dimension suggests that spiritually one can take on a variety of standpoints. We can interpret this distinction as a distinction between our embodied situatedness and phenomenal transference. When it comes to immersed experience, the person is really here now. But spiritually, such a person is absent from here now. She has spiritually transferred to the there and then and sees the world from a displaced standpoint. We would not understand Conrad's position accurately if we thought that he places all experience into two groups: immersed, that is displaced, and non-immersed, that is to say, non-displaced. Rather, according to Conrad, all experiences unfold across a continuum. Pure immersion in the there and then, and pure presence here and now, they constitute the extreme poles of the continuum across which our psychic lives unfold. The contemporaneous phenomenal being here and there, as well as now and then, stands in the middle of this continuum. Conrad qualifies the experience that unfolds here and now as primary experience, and he opposes it to what he calls secondary experiences. Primary experience is characterized both by real and spiritual situatedness here and now. Secondary experience is marked by real situatedness here and now, and spiritual situatedness there and then. Now, this explains why displaced experiences are characterized by a certain deficiency. Displaced consciousness only presents what either has been or will be or could be given from the standpoint of primary experience. This means that displaced consciousness does not really transform the there into a new here, for it also experiences the non-genuine nature of this new here. When we are displaced, we are only spiritually there and then, while our bodies remain anchored here and now. Our embodied self-awareness keeps us affixed in the here and now during immersed experiences. Conrad's analysis significantly complements the account of multiple realities that we come across in Schutz. Schutz's account is primarily concerned with multiple realities and the relation between them. Conrad's account with our experience of these realities. By placing these two accounts alongside each other, we obtain a comprehensive framework which proves highly significant for our understanding of immersion in highly diverse finite provinces of meaning, including digital games. So drawing on both Schutz and Conrad, one can suggest the following, and there are a number of points that I want to single out, 5 in general. So first, while primary experience is the mode that characterizes the presence of consciousness in paramount reality, secondary experience qualifies its transition to other provinces of meaning. Now, second, just as secondary experience is a modification of primary experience in that it is both bound to and irreducible to primary experience, so various provinces of meaning are modifications of paramount reality in that they are bound to, although not reducible to, paramount reality. Now, third, transition from primary to secondary experience need not entail the forgetfulness of primary experience. So also, the transition from paramount reality to other provinces of meaning need not entail the forgetfulness of paramount reality. Now, the fourth point. For the most part, immersion in these other provinces of meaning presupposes a split self-awareness, that is, a real or embodied presence here and now, and a spiritual or phenomenal immersion in the there and then. By contrast, the presence of consciousness in paramount reality is marked by the congruence of embodied and spiritual self-awareness. And then the fifth and last point. There is one important exception. When consciousness enters the world of dreams, it disguises its split self-awareness and no longer recognizes its own self-displacement as self-displacement. Though this is an ingenious self-deception, and on its basis, consciousness loses the real awareness of its own embodied presence in paramount reality. Now, of what significance is all of this for phenomenology of immersion within the framework of game studies? Well, we now know that immersion is a much broader phenomenon than is usually assumed in game studies. Immersion in digital games is one specific mode of immersion among other modes. One can qualify immersion as a secondary experience in Conrad's sense. It is an experience which unfolds from a displaced standpoint. Immersion is an experience of self-displacement, and it is made possible by a leap out of paramount reality into a different finite province of meaning. Immersive consciousness is marked by a specific self-awareness, which is characterized by a split between embodied and phenomenal self-awareness. Immersion is not a static category, but a dynamic one, which means that one can be more or less immersed in a finite province of meaning. Immersion can be either relative or absolute. So one can now state that immersion in digital games constitutes a specific form of immersion among others. But what is distinctive then about it? We can characterize it as a hybrid form of immersion. On the one hand, just like non-digital games, so digital games too call for active participation on the part of the players. Passive immersion in digital games is a contradiction in terms. In this regard, immersion in digital games differs sharply from immersion in other forms of digital media, such as television or cinema. On the other hand, and in contrast to non-digital games, digital games open up a specific space of possibilities and the space is shaped by digital technology. Specific computing devices in general and specific games in particular provide the subject with different possibilities for action and experience. As a rule, we are faced here with action and experience that unfold in a digitally shaped spatio-temporality. How are we to understand this new kind of activity? We're here required to modify some aspects of Conrad's account. The distinction between real self-awareness and spiritual self-awareness does not suffice. So recent literature on game studies suggests that avatar that the player identifies with is an embodied being, even though it is not the player's embodied self. Moreover, there is a general consensus among designers that immersion is achieved by means of advancing a sense of embodiment. So what can we then say about embodiment and digital incorporation? Well, there is a sense in which gaming experience is a disembodied experience. When immersed in a game, the player tends to ignore her actual body. And this can take extreme forms. Anecdotal evidence shows that a Taiwanese man in 2002 died from exhaustion after playing for 32 hours straight. And then there is another report also 5 years later, which suggests that a player died after playing for 7 days straight. But these are clearly exceptions to the rule, and this forces us to raise the question, what does it mean to be embodied? And here I want to turn to a third phenomenological thinker, to Husserl, and to his account of embodiment. And there are 4 points that I want to single out. So first of all, there is this concept of the lived body that we come across in phenomenology, and how we to understand it? Well, in 4 ways. First of all, the lived body is the 0 point of orientation. This means this body that I myself am is the absolute here to which all other relative here and there relate. So wherever I am in space, I'm always here and now, and everything else appears in relation to my body. The second sense, the lived body is the organ of my will and the seat of free movement. And by this, one means that, the manner in which, say, I move my hand is different from the manner in which I move a computer mouse. Right? The third aspect of the lived body is the expression of the spirit. The body is not only in general a thing, but is indeed expression of the spirit, and is at once organ of the spirit. So in this regard, one would stress in the framework of digital games that, Japanese, say, avatars are different from American avatars, and so on and so forth, because they express a certain cultural world. And then the fourth point, which is most important, the lived body is the bearer of localized sensation. Now, by this, we have to understand that the subject of experience cannot live through bodily pains or pleasures anywhere else but in the lived body. As a field of sensings, the lived body is a self-conscious body. And we are confronted here with a unique kind of self-consciousness. The sensations of which we here speak, so pain and pleasure, have immediate bodily localization. So we can only feel them in our own bodies. So now, keeping this taxonomy of the lived body in mind, we can ask, in which sense then, and to what degree, is virtual embodiment conceivable as a form of embodiment? In an extended sense, we can conceive of the virtual body of the avatar as the 0 point of orientation. At least to a degree, the game world unfolds not from my rootedness here now, but from the avatar's standpoint. So also, in an extended and somewhat modified sense, we can conceive of the avatar's body as the organ of my will and the seat of my free movement. We can even conceive of the avatar's body as the expression of spirit, that is, of a specific cultural world, something that I had already mentioned earlier. But, and this is crucial to stress, it is not possible to think of the avatar's body as the field of sensings. And this is the reason why, when the, say, avatar is wounded, the player is not in pain. Or when the avatar is exhausted, the player doesn't feel tired, at least in the same sense. So also, if the virus now affects my laptop, it doesn't affect my lived body. This then is the fundamental distinction between actual and virtual embodiment. For all that it is worth, virtual embodiment remains cut off from the body, understood as a field of senses. Now, relying on the 4 senses of embodiment, we can modify Conrad's distinction between actual self-awareness and spiritual self-awareness. At least when it comes to the immersion in digital games, phenomenal self-awareness that qualifies secondary experience is, as a rule, embodied. One can see the virtual world with the avatar's eyes. One can freely move the avatar's body by the power of the will. And the avatar's body can very well be expressive of a certain cultural world. Nonetheless, the avatar's body cannot become the actual ego's, the subject's, the person's, the individual's field of sensings. And in this sense, virtual embodiment is fundamentally unlike actual embodiment. What then makes digital games so involving? The capacity on the part of the player to appropriate the avatar's body in the first three senses that I outlined enables the player to immerse herself in the game environment. But the capacity on the part of the player to undergo virtual embodiment is what allows the player to immerse herself in the game and find the game so involving. The greater the incorporation, the greater the involvement. Now, according to one common claim that we come across in game studies, embodied absorption that characterizes digital immersion constitutes the deepest form of immersion that one can come across in human experience. Presumably, this is due to the fact that the individual is actively immersed in the digital world. This is what enables the player to live through total involvement or incorporation. These are the terms used. But we have to ask, how total is total involvement? The foregoing analysis that I offered invites us to draw a somewhat different conclusion. Involvement in digital world, taken in all its variety, can never be total, for the split between the real and the spiritual self-awareness cannot be erased. The virtual body of the avatar cannot be perceived as the actual field of sensings. So in this regard, immersion in the digital world cannot be as deep as immersion in the world of dreams, which Conrad, to whom I was referring, quite rightly qualified as total immersion, understood as secondary experience that is camouflaged as primary experience. At this point, I already want to move to the conclusion. What I tried to show to you in this talk is that there are different types of immersion, and that immersion in digital games constitutes one type of immersion among others. I built an approach which consists of three stages. So first, along with Alfred Schutz, I maintain that immersion is necessarily a matter of a leap into a finite province of meaning, and that as such, it relies on a specific kind of epoche. Second, along with Conrad, I further argued that immersion is a matter of self-displacement, which entails a displaced self-awareness. And third, along with Husserl, I further contended that this self-displacement is embodied, although not in all possible senses of the term, and that there is a good sense in which virtual embodiment is fundamentally unlike actual embodiment. Now, this analysis of embodiment carries an important implication. It is only to be expected that the future will bring significant advances in the production of technical devices. Not only VR headsets or rubber gloves, but also whole-body rubber dresses, for instance, that will be much more effectively capable of simulating embodied experiences, so including smells, changes in temperature, even bodily pleasure or pain. Advances of this nature will give rise to more immersive gaming experiences. So is it reasonable to expect then that advances of this nature will make gaming experiences indistinguishable from the in real life experiences? I do not think so, and for three reasons. So in my conclusion, I want to list those reasons. The first reason concerns temporality. Gaming experiences have a temporal beginning. Gamers can only find themselves in the game world if they first leap into this world. As the one who enters the gamer cannot help but must remain aware, no matter how minimal this awareness might be, of the contrast between primary and secondary experience. Now, the second reason, it concerns embodiment. The whole body rubber dress to which I have just referred is a dress that the player must put on, which in effect also means that the player cannot help but must remain aware of the difference between primary, actual, and secondary simulated fields of senses. And then there is a third reason also. We have never encountered any technical devices so far that would simulate actual experience to such a degree that they would eliminate all differences between actuality and virtuality. So there is the partes extra partes approach, which suggests that there is not a single feature of experience that could not be simulated. But if we take a more holistic approach, then we'll have to suggest that the whole is irreducible to the sum of its parts, and that therefore the difference between actual and virtual embodiment is irreducible. So let me then conclude by very briefly outlining the reasons why the approach here presented is important for game studies. This approach shows that immersion in digital games is to be thought of as a specific modality of immersion. And such a qualification then opens up the possibility to address digital forms of immersion from a cross-disciplinary perspective, while also building upon classical analysis of immersion that we come across in various fields. It further shows also that immersion in digital games rests on a split self-awareness between the real and spiritual self-awareness. And this renders immersion in digital games a highly fascinating and important phenomenon for any discipline that studies self-awareness. It further shows that there are more radical forms of immersion, such as immersion in dreams, than immersion in digital games. And lastly, it clarifies the sense in which immersion in digital games can be said to be an embodied experience. So, thank you very much for your attention.
That was very nice, Professor. Thank you so much again for your lecture, for your talk. That was very enlightening. I would like to begin then the discussion, bringing some comments I had as I listened to you and as I read the article. The first of them, when you talk about virtual embodiment, I couldn't help but ask myself if to some degree we could be talking about a sort of second degree immersion, in the sense that you're not exactly, because it seems to me that the avatar doesn't exactly fulfill the needs that would be required for one to talk about embodiment in a very literal sense, in the sense that, well, I move my avatar, but I'm still moving it through my hands, and it's not like I still have the mediation of my body. My real body is required in order to do that. So it seems to me it might be a misapprehension of the concept on my part, but it seems to me also that one could maybe understand that it's not exactly that you are embodied in your avatar, but you are immersed in the idea that you are embodied in your avatar. It's a kind of second degree immersion. You're only immersed in the world because you're immersed in the idea of having the perspective of your avatar, of actually being there in this body that you're not really in. So do you think that maybe makes sense in that sense? Is that what you possibly meant?
Yes, thank you for raising this issue. Indeed, it's a very important issue because, one can take different approaches, and one has taken different approaches in game studies. So one can argue that a gaming experience is a disembodied experience, and there have been those who have presented this view, and then this view has also been contested by those who argue no, it is an embodied experience. So how to resolve then this argument or this controversy? And in this regard, I think that a field like phenomenology provides us with highly important resources. The reason for that is that it allows us to draw distinctions between different senses in which we speak of embodiment. So once we distinguish those senses, we can say, indeed, well, insofar as I think of embodiment as the 0 point of orientation, well, in a sense, my immersion in the digital world allows me, right, to simulate this sense of embodiment. And so far as I think of embodiment as the free movement, so I move my body differently than I move any other object. Well, also I can simulate this in a virtual environment. So also, as I mentioned, when I think of the body as an expression of spirit, so as a particular cultural body. But one thing cannot be done, and here I'm in full agreement with you. What cannot be done is I cannot simulate in an appropriate way my sense of embodiment understood in terms of the field of senses. So my lived body is that body in which I feel my pain and my pleasures. So politicians sometimes say, I feel your pain, right? They cannot do that. Right? Nobody can do that. I can only feel in my own body. In fact, if I could feel pain in your body, that would be the most egoistic act imaginable. For it would
Yeah.
require that I appropriate your body, make it my own, right? So in this sense, I fully agree with you that there is something that fundamentally distinguishes the way in which I live in my body and the way in which I can inhabit the body of the avatar. And I would stress that that's why, as a person working in phenomenology, I find this field highly resourceful, for it allows us to clarify this matter in much greater detail. It allows us, I would argue, to resolve this controversy.
Yes. Also, another thing that I thought that was interesting here, maybe we can come back to this issue later, but I was also really interested on the way you connect immersion with displacement. And I couldn't help but wonder if displacement could not be seen as a quality of sorts of immersion that we mostly connect with digital games, for instance, but maybe not necessarily to all forms of immersion and even to all forms of games. Because if you think, for instance, about some of the examples you gave, like football, uh, I don't know if one is really displacing oneself in the sense of having to imagine that you are somewhere you are not, for instance. Because when you are playing football, you're simply playing football. You're actually doing that. It's not, you don't have to imagine that you are playing football. It's not like you are playing a video game where that simulates soccer, for instance. And you don't have, and sure, I think what you related to this idea of displacement is the fact that this state of play has a beginning and it has an end. But if that was enough for us to think that something is an act of displacement, then any temporary activity, we could say we are in an immersion situation in that sense, like when we are working or when we are eating. All of those activities have a certain stretch, have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But we don't talk necessarily about being displaced. We actually go there, so to speak. So, do you think? And will also be important for other things I wanted to discuss, because, for instance, when we talk about immersion, we can also talk about immersion not only in those sorts of playing activities, but also in meditation, for instance, right? So this implies a sort of immersion that you wouldn't necessarily connect with the fact that this is only illusory, that you're not actually in this state, that you're only simulating being in a state. So do you think, would you agree that maybe there are sorts of immersion that don't necessarily require displacement in the sense you mentioned in your article?
Yes, a very good point. Very good observations. There is something truthful about them, I believe. Indeed, one could argue that all forms of immersion come with a certain sense of self-forgetfulness. Right? If I don't forget myself, I'm not immersed. I can
Yeah.
still play a game, but then I'm a bad sport, right? I ruin the game, right? I keep thinking about other things. So self-forgetfulness must be there when it comes either to different kind of games or also to any kind of immersion. But there is something specific, there is something unique about this, immersion in digital games. And the reason for that is that here, the space of actuality and virtuality, one transitions, so to speak, into
Yeah.
the sphere of virtuality. Right? And that's why one can, in a much more direct way, speak of self-forgetfulness as self-displacement. Right? Now, this would not mean that digital games is the only field that provides us with such a possibility of self-displacement. So one
Right.
could argue that when it comes, say, to various forms of aesthetic experience, they provide us something. I can be displaced while reading a novel. I can be displaced while watching a movie. But then one can further ask, what then is specific about digital games when we think of immersion in them in the form of self-displacement alongside these other forms of self-displacement? And here one
Mhm.
would have to, from a phenomenological standpoint, emphasize the importance of the active role that the player continues to play. When
Mhm.
it comes to reading a novel or watching a movie, my experience is more passive. I follow a storyline, right? I follow a storyline, or just I follow what the movie offers me. But in a digital game provides me with a certain field of freedom, and I can choose different actions within the game. So this activity would be something that would characterize a certain unique sense of immersion as self-displacement.
I wanted to make a comment on this point, which I think is really very, very interesting about the active role of
Hmm.
self-displacement in game spaces. Because as we work basically in Games for Change, we
Hmm.
work with well, what is that idea of change? Where does that change come from?
Hmm.
Or what kind of change are we actually capable of while playing? Because it seems that, playful activities are not intended to change anything. They're just entertainment. So they are
Hmm.
leisure and they are focused on maybe not self displacement in space, but some kind of displacement in time. So, first question I would like to understand, as you mentioned, the epoche is also like a maneuver to escape some of the riddles of the present time and then to maybe uncover new possibilities for our time perception. So, in terms of games for change, the question here is one: what would we do, or what could you say about this time displacement of the self while
Hmm.
playing? And another issue, maybe another layer to the same question, is whether the self displacement could also be thought of as a displacement of the self towards him or her self, in the sense of
Hmm.
gaining consciousness of your state, of your condition in the real world. So many of the projects that we see in this Games for Change sphere are about producing consciousness
Hmm.
changes, like
Yeah.
consciousness about the environment or consciousness about your own health. So, besides the issue of time and the displacement of ourselves in time, what kind of displacement of the self can be promoted by games that relates or even induces us to gain another level of self consciousness
Hmm.
as individuals and as collective bodies?
Hmm. Yes, thank you very much for these comments. Very interesting and very important comments. They open up, I would say, um, distinct directions that one can take as one thinks either of games, or also one can say that games themselves, their potentiality cannot be expressed in the singular. What do I have in mind? And in this regard, change is of central importance here, the term that you focused on in your comment. So I spoke of the sphere of a digital game as a sphere of freedom, as a sphere of activity. And it requires this activity. If I don't have it, I no longer play. I just passively observe what is given to me. Now, this activity, on the one hand, can just be a certain form of self-forgetfulness. It can be just a certain form, of escapism. I just escape from my everyday concerns. I forget about my troubles. I find comfort in the virtual field, but sooner or later, I need to come back to the actual surroundings in which I find myself. Right? So it just provides me with a temporary escape, nothing more than that. But besides thinking of a game in terms of this kind of, besides thinking of it as within an escapist framework, one can also think of a possible augmentation of the actual reality that the game provides me with. So, in this regard, this epoche that you also mentioned that and I was referring to, Epoche provides me, on the one hand, with a possibility to escape my actual surroundings. But besides escaping my actual surroundings, it also provides me with a possibility of returning back to my everyday world in such a way that I can now think of how I can possibly change it. So, in this regard, the model to which I'm referring to is a more hermeneutical model, one can say. It was especially in a very interesting way articulated by such thinkers as Paul Ricoeur, who thought of imagination as such, as a field that can not just provide me with an escape from reality, but it can also enable me to augment the actual world in which I find myself. So just as we can, if we can say that art, for instance, has this capacity of changing and transforming our everyday worlds, maybe games can do something of the kind as well.
Lucas, do you have any other comment?
Yeah, of course. Actually, if it was up to me, we could go on all morning. I would love.
We still have some time for
Yeah,
extra comments. So please feel free to bring
yeah,
more issues that you think are appropriate, of course.
yeah. I actually wanted to come back to this discussion on self-displacement and self-forgetfulness, especially with how it seems to be connected, like Gilson said, with this idea of change. Because again, I'm still wondering if one can also draw a distinction between self-forgetfulness and self-displacement, in the sense to forget oneself does not necessarily mean to be displaced from the reality you are currently present in. Like I can play football and I can actually be playing football. I'm not displaced regarding where I am. But nevertheless, I think it was very nice of you to say that playing involves some sort of self-forgetfulness at some point, because if I'm doing this activity, I'm not thinking about myself. But that does not mean that I'm not experiencing something real that is actually here for me in the here and now, so to speak. In that sense, it only means that I'm forgetting about myself in order to have this experience. And this seems very interesting to think about immersion in terms of self-forgetfulness, because again, this might also be enlightening. I'm thinking, because you brought phenomenology to think about how this can contribute to the understanding of immersion in video games, but I think this discussion allows us to think about immersion and the experience really on a broader level. And I cannot help but remember about Dogen, this Zen Buddhist monk, who says to study the self is to forget the self, and to forget the self is to be actualized by a myriad of things. In this sense, that it's only by forgetting oneself that one can truly see things as they are, without projecting oneself into reality as such. So, to this extent that I wanted to ask you if you think that maybe on this level we could understand that the most fundamental aspect of immersion could be considered self-forgetfulness and self-displacement, in the sense of really being in a place that you're not, imagining yourself to be in a place that you're not really, would only be one of the forms that this self-forgetfulness can take. But other forms would also be possible, such as we see when you are talking about meditating or playing a game in which, there's no sense of being somewhere else. Even in video games, like if I play an abstract puzzle game, it's not exactly that I'm imagining to be somewhere I'm not. I'm just focusing on this activity in such a way that I forget about myself. Would you agree with this?
And let me add just another example, and that would be the therapeutic situation, like in a psychoanalytic session, when both the analyst and the person who is going through therapy, they seem to be playing a game of projecting the self, displacing the self to a kind of game play or to a playing space where there is a possibility of changing behavior or changing memories or even changing projects in terms of future activities. So it seems that the self is itself, so to speak, the object of play. In that
Yes, yes.
immersion can be at least between two individuals in a therapeutic situation, for instance.
Yes, yes. Yeah, this is very interesting. And here we are entering, to my mind, a sphere that is already getting quite complicated. Complicated because I personally would introduce a further, here is where I see a certain further complexity. So on the one hand, uh, there is no, one could put it as follows in sort of rather strong way, and we can say there is no such thing as the self. The
Yeah.
self is not a thing. The
Mm-hmm.
self is the self has a certain temporality. We can think a self as a life project, right?
Yeah.
So the self can only be understood in this temporal sense. The self only unfolds. The self only develops, and it can do so in a variety of ways. So that's one aspect, right? But I would also stress another aspect, and that's where the complexity comes in. Recall what I was saying about Alfred Schutz and his concept of multiple realities, and his emphasis that there is, despite the multiplicity of realities, there is such a thing as what he called paramount reality. There is an actual reality in which we live, the world characterized by our everyday concerns, the world in which we live together with others, and so on and so forth. Right? And he at the same time wanted to draw a distinction between this world of actual reality, and he was especially thinking, of the world of fiction, the scientific world, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, the self, there is no such thing as a self. The self is a certain unfolding. But on the other hand, the self is also, we find the self with an actuality. There is also an important distinction to be drawn between my actual self, and say, if I imagine myself being somebody entirely different, living somewhere else, and so on and so forth, right? So we cannot also fall victim to this kind of, bad faith, what sometimes in the Sartrean framework is called bad faith. So we need to somehow mediate between those two aspects that introduce a certain complexity. Here. And one way to do so is, as I would return back to this notion of augmentation that I mentioned earlier. That this self-forgetfulness, which comes along with the forgetfulness of the field of actuality and transitioning into, into a virtual sphere. I'm not the avatar, right? In a way, I pretend to be one. I am who I am as I forget myself and identify myself with the avatar during the game. But at the same time, my return back to my everyday surroundings, what I have lived through in the virtual sphere can be sedimented, so to speak, in my actual. It can have its own effects, and very often it does. Right? And that then raises a further possibility or a further, direction when it comes to change, right? What is it that we want to take from the virtual environment? What is it that it can provide us with that our everyday surroundings would not?
Well, I'll leave the room to Lucas to make our closing remarks. I want to thank you very, very much, Professor. We are now also publicizing the text in Portuguese and Spanish, and I hope that we keep in touch because it seems to me that we have so important and fruitful seeds. Thank you for your presence. Officially opening our 10th Games for Change Latin America Festival. Lucas, you do the final remarks, and if Professor Saulius wants to give us his final remarks. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, I just maybe wanted to make one final comment, because I also thought that it was really interesting and fascinating that you brought this issue of the primary reality up. It was also one of the things I wanted to mention, because this is a fascinating field that connects with new realism, with this conception of new realism, according to which there's no such thing as one world, which is the one world in which we inhabit, but rather we inhabit different fields of sense which to me seemed very close to this idea of the finite province of meaning that you mentioned. Yeah. But the difference here in that sense is that for this perspective from Marcus Gabriel, for instance, there's no primary reality. You only have different finite provinces of meaning through which we transit. So even this world we tend to imagine as being one world in which we are is actually made of many different worlds we transit through. So I just mean that has a remark that seems interesting to me, because again, this may also imply that to forget the self is not necessarily to be displaced from the reality in which you are actually in, because it's like that. How can I think it's very interesting what you said, like, how can I be playing if I keep remembering about myself? But this is also true about reading a book, and in order to really understand the book, I have to actually forget myself. Otherwise, I'm going to be focused on something that is not what I'm actually experiencing there. So I think there's a lot of things we could still talk. I'm really looking forward to having other opportunities for us to discuss. But I just wanted to say that I think it's very fascinating and very important how your article allows us to bring all those connections between those different fields, not only from philosophy, from within philosophy and from without, but also different trends in philosophy that are very current and very relevant today. But if you could, I would like to ask you one final question for your concluding remarks, in the sense that in your paper, you talked mostly about how you thought that phenomenology could contribute to this discussion in game studies about the concept of immersion. Do you think there's any way in which the other way around is also possible, in the sense, to what extent can game studies help to discuss issues in phenomenology or in philosophy in general, for instance? I would be very much interested in hearing from you for that. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You touch here indeed on further highly important issues. Maybe at first I'll just take very shortly say a few words about, you were referring to new realism and a different kind of account of multiple realities. So just very briefly, so Schutz published his paper on multiple realities in 1945. At the time he was in New York. And a number of his students, such as Peter Berger and others, they are the ones who later became the so-called social constructionists. Now, there is an important difference between a phenomenological account of multiple realities and an account of multiple realities that we come across in social constructionism. So social constructionists were exactly the group of thinkers who thought that there is no need for us to preserve the distinction between paramount reality and other derived realities in the secondary sense. From a phenomenological standpoint, there is a need for this distinction. And I, the person that I am, the thinker that I am committed to this distinction. I think there is a very important difference, to put it bluntly, between the death of an avatar and my own death. I think, for better or worse, there is such a phenomenon as the phenomenon of bad faith. I think there is an experience of displacement, and that has a lot to do precisely with a sense of embodiment in which I spoke. I cannot be disembodied in any sense one pleases. There is a sense in which this body is mine, unlike any other body. Of course, there would be much more to be said about it, so just briefly, I wanted to emphasize this because it's of importance. Now, the last question that you raised is of greatest importance to me. I'm trying to think of it in a circular relation. There is something that phenomenology must contribute to game studies. There is something that game studies must contribute to phenomenology. Now, the very fact that we are engaging phenomenologically in a discussion of what virtual games are is already the most direct answer to your question. Clearly, somebody like Alfred Schutz was not thinking of digital games. Clearly, somebody like Theodor Conrad was not thinking of that. The technology was not there. The practice was not there, right? So in a number of ways, what we come across in game studies, not only, there is a lot that phenomenology can take from such fields as game studies, but to my mind, it must if it is to stay alive. And so far, it has shown a remarkable capacity to be alive. Few philosophical traditions have been alive for 120 years, right? It's remarkable, and it continues to be vibrant. So this would be a brief answer to a very good question, and of course, it's there would be further answers that we would need to articulate. Now, lastly, I would like to thank you both again for engaging in this discussion, for raising these questions, for making these comments. I very much enjoyed this discussion, and it's wonderful to see, Hong Kong is virtually on the other side of the globe than Brazil, but here we see how much we have in common, and how many common interests we have that we share. So I also hope that we will be able to continue this discussion in the future. Thank you.